West Virginia. Almost heaven. They say life's old there, older than the trees but younger than the mountains. Today, rail service is provided by Amtrak's soon-to-be-gone Capital Limited and Cardinal, and select places MARC's Brunswick line. But, did I ever tell you that along with the Capital Limited, there used to be 4 Amtrak trains that served a lot more of West Virginia, while also taking passengers to America's capital? Well, let's talk about it. West Virginia's rail service in general was of a huge importance to the country's railroads because of its landscape. Both the Allegheny and the Blue Ridge Mountains are a big part of the larger Appalachian mountain range. West Virginia itself was also a huge important connection for the Midwest to the eastern seaboard of the U.S. The costs of traversing the Appalachian mountain range limited the number of main routes across the state, while the demand for travel between the East Coast and the Midwest sped up the early construction of rail lines by a lot. The natural resource industries generated traffic for new connecting rail lines and additional main lines to Tidewater, Virginia. Of course, as the story often went, the railroads everywhere across America saw a massive decline in passenger service in the 50s and 60s due to rising highway and air travel. People just didn't want to take the train anymore. Soon after the last intercity train crossed through West Virginia, Amtrak quickly took over all service. But they didn't get to West Virginia until around 4 months in. This is because, on its startup on May 1st, 1971, Amtrak did not continue running any of the 3 B&O intercity trains operating west of Cumberland, Maryland at the time. Commuter services between DC and Martinsburg continued unaffected by the takeover. Amtrak's first train in West Virginia was called the West Virginian, operating between Washington, D.C. and Parkersburg, crossing the border with Maryland way too many times. It made its inaugural run on September 8, 1971, making it their first train on B&O trackage. Equipment was pretty standard for the early Amtrak train, a rusted EMD F unit with 2 or 3 ex-C&O passenger cars. As said earlier, the West Virginian went from DC to Parkersburg, West Virginia, a distance of roughly 350 miles. It had 11 stops total with termini included. It started at Washington, D.C.'s Union Station, then made its first stop at Silver Spring, then continued on to serve Brunswick, Harper's Ferry, Martinsburg, Cumberland, Keyser, Oakland, Grafton, Clarksburg, and Parkersburg. The route length came out to 351 miles. It ran once daily on the weekdays only. Travel time is also unknown, but I'm going to make it my best guess to say that it took 5 hours at the very least. In 1972, Amtrak decided to run a test on one of their 2 new but very unreliable UAC turbo train sets. This set specifically had just come from a test run from Boston to New York City. They wanted to test it in West Virginia to see how the train could handle a mountainous landscape, to see if they could bring new equipment to the route, finally replacing those F units. Plus, the West Virginian route in general had pretty bad ridership so far, so they wanted to see if newer and modern takes on equipment meant higher ridership. Critics often questioned the idea of running the train in a region where mountains and curves limited the train to a top speed of 80 miles per hour. Concluding that it was overall a bad idea, Amtrak withdrew the equipment on May 13th that year to replace the other turbo train on the New York to Boston run. The train had in turn been sent to Washington for the Transport Expo in 1972. With that failed experiment out of the way, Amtrak decided to discontinue the West Virginian altogether out of nowhere. This was likely due to low ridership. It made its last run on April 28, 1973, and was replaced with a similar train, although it was truncated. Let's move on to this new train, shall we? Just over a week after the West Virginian's discontinuance, Amtrak launched the Blue Ridge as its replacement. It was called the Blue Ridge likely due to it running close or through the Blue Ridge mountain range. The Blue Ridge was more or less a commuter train. It was truncated to only as far as Cumberland, Maryland, causing Keyser, Oakland, Grafton, Clarksburg, and Parkersburg to be stuck without a rail connection to DC. It also had its schedule modified to run at more convenient times. While the West Virginian's westbound schedule was conducive to the daily work trip, the eastbound schedule was not. The Blue Ridge's schedule was designed to help meet the needs of Berkeley and Jefferson County's fast-growing urban population of supercommuters, traveling on a daily basis to Washington, D.C. and the suburbs of Montgomery County, Maryland. In December of 1975, the Blue Ridge became the first train outside of the Northeast Corridor to receive the new Amtrak coaches after running with only 3 cars for its consist from the former C&O. In 1976, the Blue Ridge was once again truncated to only run as far as Martinsburg, West Virginia, leaving Cumberland with one less daily train. This was due to the inauguration of a third train, the Shenandoah, which we'll talk about later. The Blue Ridge had one round trip every day between Monday and Friday, all fitting into the schedule of the typical DC area businessman. On Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays, the train operated on a different but still convenient schedule to allow passengers more convenient travel to and from West Virginia, especially day trips to Harper's Ferry. Unfortunately, weekend service was dropped on October 1st of 1981 because of budget cuts to Amtrak services. In 1986, the Blue Ridge route was transferred to the Maryland Department of Transportation, which meant it was basically discontinued in a way. Maryland DOT wound up incorporating it into the present-day Brunswick line, a part of MARC, or Maryland Area Regional Commuter, Maryland's commuter rail network. As part of the transfer, Amtrak agreed to subsidize the train for 5 years. MARC continued to use the name until the late 1980s. Well, now that that's done, let's discuss the third train that West Virginia once had. Earlier, I said that the Blue Ridge was truncated to only Martinsburg, West Virginia, due to the inauguration of the Shenandoah. The Shenandoah is the third route to discuss today, named after the Shenandoah River. It went from Washington, D.C. to Cincinnati, Ohio. It was inaugurated on Halloween of 1976. Unfortunately, this new Shenandoah service ended up being very short-lived, but it still lasted longer than the West Virginian. The Shenandoah had a pretty much identical route to the first 2 trains we discussed, except it stopped at a lot more stations intersecting the Maryland and West Virginia border many times. It started at DC's Union Station and made its first stop at Silver Spring, and then continued on to serve Rockville, Gaithersburg, Brunswick, Harper's Ferry, Duffields, Martinsburg, Hancock, Cumberland, Keyser, Oakland, Rowellsburg, Grafton, Clarksburg, Parkersburg, Athens, Chillicothe, and finally terminating at Cincinnati's River Road Station with connections to the Mountaineer to Chicago, which we'll get into in a bit. The total route length came out to 546 miles, covered in just about 14.5 hours on a single daily round trip. The Shenandoah actually had a really short consist, usually consisting of an EMD F40PH or a General Electric P30CH, and just 2 cars, an Amfleet coach and an Amfleet Cafe car east of Martinsburg. West of that, 2 additional coaches were added for the more heavily used segment between Martinsburg and DC. This is one of the major reasons why this train failed. Because of this short consist and just lack of demand, the route never saw a lot of ridership, as it also ran with the Blue Ridge, which had a lot more convenience when it came to frequency. In January of 1978, in order to allow connections from the Shenandoah to the Midwest and western cities in Cincinnati, the schedule was changed from a daylight schedule to an overnight schedule. Thus, the schedule was widely similar to B&O's National Limited that operated prior to Amtrak. Amtrak unfortunately discontinued the Shenandoah on September 30th of 1981, citing extremely low ridership. Amtrak considered the Shenandoah one of its weakest lines, and the Department of Transportation had recommended its discontinuance since 1979. Service on the DC to Cumberland section of the Shenandoah was replaced by the new DC to Chicago Capital Limited. The Cincinnati to Cumberland portion never regained passenger service, and CSX abandoned most of the track. With that unfortunate story out of the way, let's move on to the final and probably the most unique lost train that West Virginia once had. This final service is called the Mountaineer, formerly run by the famous Norfolk and Western Railway. The Norfolk and Western, with 20 other major railroads, joined Amtrak in 1971, but before that it ran one of their premier trains called the Pocahontas, running between Cincinnati, Ohio and Norfolk, Virginia, while crossing through West Virginia. Post-1971, the Mountaineer operated as a section of the Chicago to Washington, D.C. / Newport News James Whitcomb Riley between Chicago and Cincinnati. The two trains separated at a Chesapeake and Ohio Railway yard in Ashland, Kentucky, with the Riley continuing to Washington and Newport News, while the Mountaineer continued to Catlettsburg in Kentucky, and points east roughly 25 minutes behind the Riley. The westbound procedure was reversed. The train itself wasn't fully inaugurated until March 24th of 1975, with that day marking the return of passenger service along the former Norfolk and Western Railway. Amtrak guaranteed only 2 years of operation, while warning that the train would cause them to gradually lose money. It might have not lasted long, but at least they warned people about it. To make the run viable, the Mountaineer would need to carry 150 to 300 people a day between Norfolk and Cincinnati. In 1976, Amtrak announced several possible changes to the Mountaineer, including a later schedule through West Virginia and combined operation west of Cincinnati with both the Riley and an unnamed Washington to Denver train, but this never happened. Under this plan, the Mountaineer would receive new Amfleet equipment but lose its sleeping car. The schedule changes never actually took place, but Amtrak was still forced to re-equip the Mountaineer after a harsh winter damaged many of its old steam-heated coaches and locomotives. The Mountaineer was one of the 8 routes suspended in January of 1977 and returned with an all-Amfleet consist minus the sleeping car. At first, the Mountaineer's typical consist was 5 cars, a baggage dorm car, 2 coaches, a grilled diner, and a 10-6 sleeper car. When available, one of the coaches was a dome car. Starting in January of 1977, Amtrak ran a consist of just 3 new Amfleet cars, typically 2 coaches and a cafe. The Mountaineer had the longest route out of all of the trains we discussed in this video, running nearly 1,000 miles from Chicago to Norfolk via Cincinnati. It started in Chicago Union Station, then made stops at the following: Peru, Marion, Muncie, Richmond, Cincinnati, South Portsmouth, Catlettsburg, Williamson, Welch, Bluefield, Narrows, Christiansburg, Roanoke, Bedford, Lynchburg, Farmville, Nottoway, Petersburg, Suffolk, and Norfolk. The total length of the route came out to 968 miles, and the trip time came just shy of under 25 hours, running daily surprisingly. Ridership on the Mountaineer over its 2-year probationary period was disappointing. 58,991 in 1975 and 53,400 in 1976, and averaged over a 365-day year. This was averaging 161 passengers a day in 1975 and 146 in 1976. By 1977, daily ridership had plummeted to just 35 a day. Amtrak lost a lot more money than expected, over $5.5 million in 1975's fiscal year and nearly $15 million in 1976's fiscal year. After a brief respite, Amtrak finally decided to discontinue the Mountaineer on May 31st of 1977. Replacing the Mountaineer the very next day was the Hilltopper, which operated between Washington, D.C. and Tri-State Station in Catlettsburg, Kentucky, only serving 3 towns in West Virginia: Bluefield, Welch, and Williamson. The Hilltopper didn't last long either, being discontinued just 2 years after inauguration, on September 30th, 1979. Today, in 2024, only 2 long-distance trains still serve West Virginia: Amtrak's Capital Limited from Chicago to DC, and the Cardinal from New York City to Chicago. MARC's Brunswick line also serves part of West Virginia, providing commuters a 1-seat ride from Washington, D.C. to Martinsburg, with a branch line to Frederick that gets only served a few times a day. The entire Brunswick line operates weekday rush hours only, with 9 trains a day each way. In my honest opinion, that's not good frequencies at all, but that's just me. I hope you all enjoyed this video about West Virginia's lost Amtrak trains. If you did, be sure to like, subscribe, do whatever as always, and I'll see you all in the next video. Have a great day.